Hello, and welcome to Sean's Thoughts, a podcast where I essentially talk about whatever comes to my mind. And, well, whatever comes to my mind is often sometimes very complex and very strange, but yet I thank you for sharing your attention with me today, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about all the thoughts that I'm thinking. And yeah, I'll start off by saying I apologize. Last night I had posted that I was going to do a live stream at 8:18, and that was pushed forward as I was in the middle of watching a movie with my son. I'm watching currently the third movie in the Matrix series, and yeah, it's really interesting picking up on the hidden messages and the hidden meanings within that movie and how it relates perhaps to the world we're ongoing through right now. And I eventually probably will do a whole entire podcast perhaps about that. And yet, for the past little while, so first of all, to finish that apology, I apologize that I was late, regardless of who you were, deep state, fan or subscriber or whatever it is, you were waiting, and I apologize. And then again, I rescheduled it and made it to this morning at 5:55, and yet I woke up at 6:15. And so it seems that I wasn't intended to do the podcast, or perhaps the one that I'm doing right now, the one that's titled in the way that it's titled, was more of the one that I did yesterday, the second one, where I painted more of how I see New Earth being, because for everyone, it will be different. And a great case in point for how we see the world different is when we look at religion, for example. Religion, in my opinion, has been utilized in order for its own agenda. And this is seen nowhere other than what we see in the life of Jesus. Yes, I guess I'm finally doing this talk. You see, a long time ago, or a few years ago back, anyways, I did this podcast episode on possibilities where I talked a couple things about Jesus, and Jesus being the center figure of several religions, and then a important part of many other religions, essentially being a key figure in a lot of spiritual and religious organizations, we'll call them. And so today I kind of wanted to share what I have come to understand Jesus as. And this is all through my own research from various sources. Yes, one of them happens to be Kim Gogan as a major source, perhaps, and yet a lot of her information aligns with other resources that I've had, from Dolores Cannon to there was a channel that talked about different books, these books, parts of the Bible, perhaps once, such as the Gospel of Thomas, and that they say was actually written possibly by Jesus himself. And anyways, so I'm going to get into a story, and keeping in mind it's a story. I highlight and underline that word. It's a narrative, because the reality is we are unable to know how much of our reality is true. Yes, we can invest our history, and we could have grown up in families where our families believe the same thing, and therefore they pass that belief down. We could have even been reborn into religion, having wayward lives prior, and then believing that we found the answer. And, the important part is that we're connecting with love. That's a comment that I made some time ago, or sometime within the last week. Time seems to be all going by very fast, where the commenter had talked about religious zealots. And the way that I interpreted what they were saying was that all religions were overly that way. And yet, one of the aspects that I have deemed or gleamed for myself through observing, befriending, and essentially learning about these types of things from other people is that most people who follow religions are very good people. So regardless of what the story is that they're behind, and even the emotional impact that they reinforce and therefore sometimes even project upon everyone else, is, in my opinion, somewhat irrelevant. Yes, this energy of dying for your God has contributed to many, many wars throughout our history. The fundamentals, I believe, within there, the communityship, the support of one another, the love that's within the connections, yes, it's been manipulated, but nonetheless, I think that the whole aspect of Jesus, for example, what I glean from the lessons and such, even from those spelled out in the book of Thomas, are fundamentally about love, forgiveness, compassion, all of the higher vibrational stuff. And so I think it's definitely worth examining a lot of this information, whether it comes from a holy text or if it comes from a channeled text or if it just comes simply from someone pondering and wondering and perhaps accumulating this information, such as I have, putting it together in such a way that it allows for thought experiments. It allows for consideration of the possibilities of what could be. And when we recognize that there is and there are external influences all around us that perhaps project and essentially attempt to control our way of thinking and how we act, and if we understand all of that, then we can understand that anything could have been remixed. And that's a great case in point in my latest do no thing ad where I had a whole bunch of ants singing a song. Now, originally, when I uploaded that video, it had one audio, like the ants were speaking a certain way. I recall it vividly. And yet, when I went to look at it on someone else's tablet, I noticed the ants had a different tone of voice. One ant spoke and the other ones didn't. And I noticed there was a change already within the audio of that video. And so I recognize that this is something that can happen whenever. Hello to you. I shot something. The stream is about my thoughts. And today we are going to, and I'll jump right now to what I was going to talk about, which is the information about how I have come to see, well, in this case, Jesus and his life. I've done a lot of research, I've mentioned before. And so let's start off. So I didn't do too much research into the origin story. So we hear the origin story as a baby was born by a virgin mother, perhaps, and, you know, three wise men and all that lovely stuff. But what I did start off by learning is that when the man we know as Jesus, and from my understanding, this being was able to arrive, you know, incarnate, we'll use it, upon certain cycles within humanity. And that, yeah, I guess we'll just start that when he was a young man, he lived with a group called the Essenes. And the Essenes, they were a small community or a smaller community of people who essentially had something to do with early Christianity. And they lived in a community of love, and very similar, at least when I was reading the books that I was reading, I saw a similar type of community, such as the community houses in China. Now, these houses would be communal, meaning that the people would live on the outsides, and then within the inside would be the community areas. And so people would have their, we can call them apartments or hobbles or whatever it is we're looking at, but all these interconnected the homes that essentially created a fortified wall on the outside, and yet on the inside, this community thrived together. So that's in my understanding of how he originally came to the first portions of his life, is living with the Essenes and learning many different things with the Essenes. And then when we moved on from there, and I'm going to keep this in more of a short form because I tend to run on certain things, and I'm sure I'm going to run on something. So from there was a time when Jesus had left and he had ventured as per what I learned of. And like I said, this is not necessarily true. This is a story. I'm going to interject that there again, because challenging people's beliefs is sometimes a dangerous sport, because people are so interconnected. And yet my understanding was that this being that we knew as of Jesus, he ended up traveling to the mystery schools in Egypt. And we have had a considerable amount of secrets withheld from us, different underground libraries and different underground, even civilizations with knowledge spanning back eons that we're unaware of. And, you know, through even my exploration in video games, when I was playing the series Assassin's Creed, they seem to have a lot of interesting synchronicities planted within that game that even had to do with religion and ancient alien theory and even different religious theories put into there. The whole empire and the whole Roman thing, and Egyptian empire, and even the figures, which the iconic figures from those civilizations have been immersed within this video game. So, from my understanding, and there's a rather large truck making noise. From my understanding, Jesus learned a lot of things in these mystery schools, or the being known as Jesus. I'm just going to start referring to him as Jesus, and I'll explain the being known as Jesus later, why I make that reference. But what Jesus learned a lot of things. And what I've come to understand of the things he had learned is more similar to being a Jedi, if you are aware of the movie Star Wars. Jedis are people who from all over the world are able to manipulate, not necessarily manipulate, but control perhaps a part of reality that most people are unaware of. So in the movie, they showed that the Jedi were able to like lift star cruisers out of ponds if they were really strong and had that really strong belief in themselves and their self-confidence, believing they could do as opposed to just try. So lessons from Yoda definitely would have perhaps been a teaching plan for beings like Jesus, and turning things into other things and using mind control just through the words that are said in a certain way. So you can kind of look at that as spell casting, similar to Harry Pond without his wand. The wand could just simply be, for instance, a permission slip. Yet that there were these beings that were Jedis having these miraculous powers that relied a lot in belief for them to work. So even in the movie Jedi, sometimes people were able to overcome mind tricks because they didn't believe, or they believed they were more powerful than that. And sometimes they were. Sometimes they were able, the dark side characters were able to overcome the power of a Jedi. And so how I see the mystery schools is these beings essentially learning these tricks and tools and abilities, and more so abilities, and more so not learning them, but realigning with them as if they were always within each of us. And so when Jesus came back to his homeland, he came back to the homeland with all of these miraculous abilities that he had realigned with, that he had reconnected with through his studies and training. And he had become a stronger version of himself, a higher version of himself, perhaps. And interestingly enough, from my studies, found that when he returned to his homeland, his ability to use these abilities was definitely lowered. And I have come to surmise that that was because the people around him didn't believe. They knew who he had been, and so they projected their remembrance of him perhaps upon him, therefore decreasing his ability to use his abilities. Because part of what we see in the world all around us is a co-creative aspect. It means that we have participated all together subconsciously through our programs. I honestly believe that a lot of the things we call our subconscious is basically really strong programs that have been implanted in the collective consciousness, so that when we draw from our experiences to create our present moment, that we utilize a lot of these programs that have been inserted into our so-called subconscious. And so when he arrived to a place where they didn't believe him as much. But yet when he met with people that perhaps didn't know who he was, or they were already within the narrative of who he was, listening to their friends and families and the people who had witnessed things. And that drew strength into the belief of what he could do, and that he was able to do many miraculous things that almost seemed as if they were godlike. And yet people knew him as a boy. And yet, if we look back in our history, we can see that there's a definite pattern of using false gods. And in some cases, many false gods, many so much that some places like Rome in its early times, as well as the Persians and the Greeks especially, the Vikings, the Egyptians, they all lived in what they called, I can't think of the word now, but they all lived with many different gods, and there was many different gods for many different things. Each aspect of their society seemed to have had a different god, which people seem to have memorized them all. And so that was a time when the adapting the belief that a being that had superpower, like Superman, for example, that some people would worship this being as a god, and yet perhaps this being was simply another Homo sapien, or an incarnated being within a Homo sapien, who had learned how to be more than the community itself allowed for. And that he had these abilities to heal. He had abilities to, as they said, walk on water and turn water into wine and do all of these seemingly miraculous things. And yet I feel the overall message from what I have gleaned is that he was explaining that this energy was within us all. And see, his miraculous abilities seem to have drawn together a collective of people who were worshiping him. And that's where this other story that I started off with comes into play. And what that is that there was a video on this channel, and I've mentioned it in my earlier podcast, of where it asked, what if Judas knowingly betrayed Jesus? Meaning that what if Jesus had actually asked Judas to betray him, setting it up so that there was a situation where he could go through the steps, and as if it was his plan to, and for that to happen. Because back to the message being that perhaps we all have this energy and this ability within us. And when I say all, I mean all of us Homo sapiens. I've come to understand that we have a lot more abilities than we've ever realized, from telepathy to intuitive gut feelings, where we're actually feeling people's emotions. I've practiced working on that. There's things called astral projections and, you know, other things where, and this is actually in and utilized by militaries, being able to sit in one place and then with your mind, move your mind into other locations and even draw maps. And there's this movie called Men Stare at Goats or something like that. And it actually showcases a program within the US military that, from my understanding, is accurate or semi-accurate, where the military was utilizing soldiers, telepathic soldiers, in order to infiltrate bases from far away and find intel and stuff. So these abilities that Homo sapiens have exhibited have been utilized for a very long time. There's been other projects and other groups from lots of different things, and I won't go into a whole bunch of names, but there's been a lot of different showcasings that we ourselves perhaps had this. And maybe, just maybe, I've come to the understanding that that's what we were being told. And then I learn about that there's these cycles that happen quite often. And in this case, this cycle is 1,008 years. And 1,008 years times 2 takes us back 2016 years to when Jesus was here. and that perhaps that he came at a time where he knew that there was a message to seed, to plant, to essentially insert into the collective consciousness, so that when we got to a time like now, that that seed would come to a point of blooming, and blooming with all of the wonderful aspects perhaps of his message, and releasing the aspects that were essentially used as control, trying to turn a being of God into God himself. When I've come to the belief, and this is now my belief as opposed to just part of the story, and therefore it aligns quite well with it, I've come to believe that we are of God, and that that particle "de" is very important, because it implies that we are created from and perhaps even within God, and that God is all around us and God is within us, and we are made of God, and therefore we are always quantumly connected to God. And so the message that I read through my exploration into the book of Thomas, into the alternative understandings of Jesus, led me to the idea that perhaps he was just simply giving us a message and implanting it. And the reason why he needed perhaps that whole situation with Judas to happen is for there to be a different outcome to the story rather than the one that was happening. And the one that was happening, at least as explained in this video, and I'll perhaps try to find it again if I can, was that there was too many people that were blindly following him, not truly questioning or practicing their own discernment, that they were looking for another savior. See, we have been put into a reality where we are constantly looking out externally for saviors, whether they're in a white coat or a black judge thing, or in officers and policemen and politicians and superheroes such as the Marvels movies, which truly depict our dependence upon heroes. All of these, including the hero's journey movie mechanical scheme, they've all been utilized to put the savior outside of us, and therefore to ignore or disconnect from the fact that the savior, our savior, is within each of us. And it's actually us. It's me. I'm here to, we'll call it, save myself, and you're here to perhaps save yourself. And now there are steps, there are different paths, and there's a lot of different lessons on the path, and we're not all traveling the exact same path. And so perhaps Jesus's path was to simply ask Judas to betray him, because his worshipers were too fully believing that he was God already, and that that wasn't the intention perhaps. And so from there, we all know what happened. We watched the Mel Gibson movie, The Passion of Christ. We saw the horrible images and the crucifixion, and we saw the Roman Empire. We saw the Israelites, and we saw everything that they all participated in. We saw the betrayal. We saw the drama. We saw the trauma. You know, one of the things I'd like to point out is seeing is believing. And when we see things, when movies are made the way that they are, they're made there to put images into our minds in order for us to help co-create. So we saw all that. I watched that movie 2 or 3 times. It was a interesting movie. Even now, as I talk about the movie, I'm seeing images of blood on the forehead and the thorns that he wore and stuff like that, or pulling up the crucifix upon that long street. Anyways, I'm seeing all those images. And so my understanding was that that all happened. And then as we get from the story that he had passed, and that through that passing came a resurrection. And perhaps that's the part of the story or the narrative that leads people to believe that coming back from life meant godly powers. And yet, even if we look into our own society now, we will see that there are other beings that have come back from life, and they've come back from, or some have come back from death, and they have come back with some miraculous stories of what happened, what the things they saw, the lights they saw, the people they talked to. There's a lot of people who have actually even written books, and other people who have channeled information and such. So there's evidence, you could say, that the reality, or a reality, or perhaps a multiverse of realities exists beyond what we believe the difference between life and death is. So in the story or the narrative, Jesus comes back, and yet there is, of course, a possibility that he had never perished at all. There is a possibility that the story was manipulated to the point, and perhaps manipulated for quite a long time. You know, when we look at the diversities of religion and how many similar religions, even sometimes similar in the fact that they're believing themselves to be Christians, that there's so many different versions of Christianity, and they believe in different deities, and they believed in different variations of the story. Even they've changed their own holy textbooks and believed that theirs was the more important one. And yet perhaps the story of Jesus's reincarnation, or reanimation we'll call it, was something different than we understood. And therefore we took it upon our minds to create a story, or perhaps it was created for us and we were able to understand it through the lens that we had at that time. And yet, you know, even the stories we believed 100 years ago about our world have been significantly altered through war, altered through rewriting of our history, destroying the buildings, or at least trying to hide them under Niagara Falls. And even that's a showcased example of how our reality can and has already been changed to such a significant amount that it truly is challenging to try to understand what is real and what is not. And of course, therefore, it's important for us to strengthen our discernment that when we are hearing stories, see, often people will call themselves truth seekers. And yet, truth seekers even have the undying desire to hold steadfast to the belief that create their fundamental core, when their actual fundamental core beliefs could simply be part of a greater lesson in love and compassion. And so back to what I was saying about that commenter, when they said, you know, it's going to be very challenging to overcome the belief systems of all these religious zealots. And yet I disagree with that. And I actually disagreed immediately. I see that perhaps overcoming traumas that we've held on to, regardless if it was war or famine or struggle or homelessness, rape, there's so many different traumatic stresses, the losing a parent, or essentially not having love from a parent and growing up by yourself. Like, those traumas are significantly challenging to overcome, perhaps for some, because our world does house and hold so much trauma. And yet, to recognize that perhaps a truth seeker wasn't looking at the full truth and is able to adjust themselves, and yet they still hold and maintain all of those beautiful lessons of compassion and love and caring, and, you know, even the idea that the possibility of bringing things such as an animal back to life, or perhaps that life and death aren't exactly what we thought of, and even our own ability to perhaps walk on water isn't what we thought it was. To adjust that, I think, is perhaps for some maybe quite easy. And then once we spread and re-immerse that already learned lessons of love and compassion, we intermingle that into society overall, that we can therefore step it up a level considerably. And so after that experience that Jesus experienced, I recently, and I say this recently because this was really recently, it should be on the next GIA report if you have the opportunity. They published them 7 days later, and I think it's the April 13th when this one will be published. But Kim continues to tell the story of after the so-called crucifixion resurrection, that Jesus had actually traveled to France and lived the life within the secrecy of being in France. Interestingly enough, if you're aware of the French language, the sentence "je suis" which means I am, and it sounds or it's written very similar to the word Jesus. There was always something interestingly there put there through synchronicity, perhaps. Even in the movie The Da Vinci's Code, there was a connection to the Louvre, the Louvre, or anyways, that big famous museum in France. And there was a connection in that movie that depicted or told the story of perhaps Jesus wasn't a celibate person. Perhaps he had a wife. Perhaps he fathered children. And that was all intermingled into the movie itself. And perhaps he did create a bloodline that lived on even past and after he was discovered and essentially removed with several of his children, as per the story that I received on the Global Intelligence Agency report. And yet, it's important even in there to note that the bloodline perhaps did continue on as depicted in the movie. And see, bloodlines are something that most people aren't aware that have been prized and covenanted throughout our history. Nowhere better explained or depicted when you look at the kings and queens of the world, how their goal was always to maintain the bloodlines, that living outside of love was more important to these differing characters of kings and queens and duchesses and princes and princesses. Maintaining that pure bloodline was more important than love. And so for those people, they would always intermarry within their own families and within their own bloodlines, mixing the bloodlines perhaps when it came to their desired outcome, but yet keeping those bloodlines pure enough that they would be able to maintain and hold on to that power, perhaps even looking for it. And that goes back all the way to the Jedis that I was talking about. One of the interesting parts about the whole Jedi mythology on Star Wars is that the Jedis had these things called midichlorians within their blood, that these beings didn't just wake up and learn how to, be Jedis. That yes, they had to go to schools to learn, mystery schools, perhaps, maybe the Jedi Academy in Star Wars or the Jedi home office or home base was a mystery school, but they had to develop these skills. But yet there was still perhaps a biological component that was within the bloodline or within the blood, perhaps, of that being. And in the Star Wars things, these were called midichlorians, and they were something that, you know, Darth Vader, for example, and Luke Skywalker and Anakin and all the other beings that were Star Trek Jedis, that they had this level within them. And in the case of Anakin and even Obi-Wan Kenobi, they were actually pretty high. And perhaps these same particles or same energy, and we'll use the word energy, although I understand energy to be artificial, but we'll use that as a good way to explain it, that perhaps this energy was within Jesus. And on top of that, I mentioned cycles, that this isn't the first time to happen. Cycles are repetitive situations that come up, certain alignments. See, we'll call them elite of the world, they recognized the alignments and the cycles of moons and stars and lots of different astrological cycles, and they valued them pretty high. And my understanding, even from research, other research, is they would even pass laws and do bills and have meetings and do ceremonies and elect new officials and do all of this government stuff. And they would be aligned with the dates of astrological calendars and such, the important days, believing that they had higher probability of success if they did things on a certain day. And that seems, at least as I even say it, somewhat weird. And yet our world operated considerably different with a whole different set of beliefs than I ever imagined actually existing. And so back to the story, or concluding what I had heard about Jesus, is that Jesus perhaps did extend his bloodline, and it did perhaps extend into our world today. To the degree of how it extended, I'm uncertain, considering the fact that if we are living in a matrix, we are living in digital reality overlaid, then, it's hard to say what happened in this reality and what has actually been altered from a previous reality. And even that can be explained or shown or depicted within the Bible holding many, many stories that are far more ancient and than the Bible. And they go back to other characters from other religions who told a lot of the similar stories with the similar deities, just essentially changing the name. And so there's a lot of people who believe that certain characters were or played the same roles, perhaps through different timelines or different reincarnations of that character. And yeah, that all goes back into what the Matrix is, what overlays are. And yet, perhaps this being named Jesus has been here far more than one time. Maybe he has been here multiple times, knowing that our historical calendar, you could say, goes back hundreds of thousands of years, as opposed to going back the 2 to 5,000, 6,000 years that they try to convince us thereof. And so I'm going to leave it there, I think. This vehicle is sitting there eating his breakfast sandwich while listening to really loud music, and that's kind of distorting the flow. But I think that the information is there of what I have learned. And as I said, and I want to conclude this important point, it's not about the truth or the accuracy of the things I've said. It's more important to, as a truth seeker, if you call yourself that, and there are many people who do believe themselves to be truth seekers, and yet they may also call themselves religious. And yet, a truth seeker, in my opinion only, is a person who's willing to examine all aspects of something, to look at all possibilities of something, and not to get stuck in one rendition or one projection of a story. A truth seeker is going to look for truth. They're going to explore the possibilities and keep an open mind, I believe. And using or utilizing their discernment, they'll take what resonates with them, because not all parts of a story may resonate, but some may. Some might lead them down a path of exploration to another piece of information. And this piece of information might give them the keys to come back and lock more of that previous information, and therefore leading them on to a whole new discovery of something that was similar but yet different enough that it could spawn or perhaps bloom into a whole new understanding of reality. And while this story is about Jesus, there are other biblical figures as well that perhaps had different stories than we have been brought up to believe. And that through these different stories, perhaps religion was a tool that was infiltrated to the point that they could turn us against each other and essentially influence us to create sins against one another. And that greatest sin was harming another person, killing them. That being the greatest sin that perhaps caused the quickening and brought us to a state of mortality, where we were therefore more susceptible to the belief that we die and that we are unlike beings such as Noah. Noah lived to like 940, and he's the mythical character in the Bible when it comes to the Great Reset, which was the flood. And he lived a lot longer. And even the sons of Abraham, I think it was, lived to pretty old ages. And so there's a lot of people who believed enough in living a lot longer. And yet perhaps we have gotten to the state of immense war and gossip and arguments and so many different vile things that we don't even understand are vile. And perhaps we co-contribute them on a daily basis, which leads to the decreasing of our own personal lives. So perhaps with exploring some of these things and, you know, seeing the possibilities of what could be, could lead us into something that is far more beautiful than the reality that we have been currently co-creating right now. And lastly, and I think this is very important to this talk, is there is a skill or an ability that we have to harm one another through the gossip that we use. That when we sit and we talk negatively about other people, and we shun them or dismiss them or criticize and bring them down, and we tell these little stories that maybe perhaps prop us up. That when we're doing that, when we're gossiping about each other and we're doing it with negative energy, whether it's that we think that we're better or we're criticizing the other person, that we're actually sending that negative energy at that person, and that person is taking on that psychic attack. And it is a psychic attack, especially if it is negative. So one word of caution is that when you're either discussing what I've talked about today or just discussing anything that anyone's talked about, ensure that you do your best to maintain a higher level of vibration in the subject matter or the way that you talk about other people. For when, as I said, we send that negative energy through our negative, and I say negative, of course, it can be positive as well, and I highly encourage positive, but yet if someone's criticizing someone else for things that they had said and, you know, being dismissive or, you know what I'm talking about, gossip. When we do gossip in a certain way about someone else, it's bringing that person down. But the most important part of that is it's also being reflected back on you, back on the person that's actually putting those words out into the ripple effect of our reality. And if it can't hit you, sometimes it hits those that we love around us. And so be very aware that when you are just coming together and talking and discussing, that holding up your vibration in that state of love, in that state of compassion that is Jesus's message, in my opinion, that we are therefore being mindful of how we talk about one another and with one another, because it does definitely play a fundamental part in how they controlled us, getting us together around tables, coffee shops, wherever it is, and getting us to talk negatively, even about the politicians and the so-called elite kings and queens and the fake royals of the world, the royals we're not even aware of yet. And talking all this negativity and dismissing about them leads to our own so-called quickening that we experience, and that is essentially lowering our own ability to thrive and to live. So I just wanted to add that on to the end because I think it's a very important lesson that I can say that I did learn from, well, so-called insiders and former gurus, and well, former insiders maybe is a better word for it, from different books and informations, Paul Saleg and Kim Gogan and Kevin Trudeau and even John Gray. So many different ones, and Andrew Carnegie. Anyway, so many different people that, it's important to be very observant of what we say and how we say it. So with all that being said, I'm going to wish you the best day possible. I'm going to go off and enjoy. I thank everyone who shared their attention, regardless of where you're from. I'm still looking forward to knowing who's going to come forth first, who's going to come forth first, and perhaps confirm things that I'm already very aware of. And I look forward to utilizing all of that energy I had in my podcast yesterday about all the amazing things I wish to create. And the more that I spend time imagining them, the more that they're coming closer to being realized within my reality. And I look forward to sharing all of that with you. And even as those things start to manifest, and manifest simply means to realize, to become material within my reality, I'm going to share all of that. And that's really the intentions of this podcast. As someone had asked, what was the purpose or the subject? It's just simply to share that which I learn and bring together into a story-like narrative so that we can perhaps explore together the true meaning of all of this stuff that has found its way into my reality. So thank you so much for sharing your attention with me, and I look forward to sharing more of it.